Right, so the region I'll be considering today, covering an area of about 250 square miles, is the eastern end of the Sussex High Weald, the area in fact shown here in pink. The High Weald is ringed on the north, west and southwest by the Low Weald, Greensand Ridge and Chalk Downs in succession, on the east by the Romney Marsh, and on the southeast by the English Channel. It's a hilly, heavily wooded region of dispersed settlement and small farms. Incomes were often augmented by craft industries. It was also a region of iron production, and there were a few discrete areas of cloth manufacture. Unlike the adjacent South Downs, open fields were unknown. Farms were heavily biased towards cattle fat stock, with small areas of crops, mostly oats, much of which was fed back to the animals, though of course sufficient was left for feeding the local population. The households recorded in the 1662 Hearth Tax returns represent the most comprehensive surviving list for the period of rural and village houses in the High Weald. They exclude the area's 3 ports, but include the Wealden towns of Battle, East Grinstead and Horsham, though only Battle is in the area we will be considering today. Separate returns survive for the 3 Cinque ports. The returns for one of these, Rye, we will be considering very briefly later. The 1662 returns enumerate the households by 100, mostly subdivided into parish, though occasionally into tithing, and then further qualified by parish. A transcript of part of a typical return, US parish in Staple 100, is shown here. Unlike most returns for other regions of England, many entries have the added advantage of noting either the principal occupation or status group of the householder. For instance, of the 29 entries shown in this extract, only 7 give no qualification as to occupational status. Of the others, 2 are listed as gentlemen, 9 are labelled as yeomen, 7 as labourers, 1 as a mason, 1 as a smith, 1 as a carpenter, and only surprisingly 1 as a husbandman. The entire return lists a much wider range of occupations than this, but it gives you a good idea of the general spread. Because the extant Sussex returns date from the initial year of the tax, they need to be used with even greater caution than those compiled subsequently, although, as we've already heard, all the returns need to be used with great care. The main point, though, is only after 1663 was it a requirement that returns should be divided into chargeable and non-chargeable. This extra information is not included within the 1665 updates that were made to the 1662 return. They were made in the right-hand margin of the extant returns, though a good indication can be obtained from whether the tax was paid or not, and that's listed down the left-hand margin. These exempt entries are highlighted in red in the transcript of the return shown here, and in this extract they account for only 10 out of the 29. That's about 1/3 of the total. Some of the returns show higher numbers than this. As will be noted, the occupations of 3 are unspecified, but otherwise all but 2 of those who didn't pay were labourers, and I think that's significant. 1 was a yeoman, and surprisingly, 1 was a gentleman, but more of him later. The 3rd is part of a combined entry, but whether he occupied part of Darby's house or whether he occupied a separate house owned by Darby is untellable. Both of these options are known to occur in the Sussex returns. Although not common, joint entries of this type are found in a small number throughout the return. Another example in this sample is William Martin's 7 flue assessment, where 2 of the 7 were paid by John Yelding. In another entry, a widow was excused paying for 1 flue. Was it because it had been taken down? Was it in an unused part of the house? Or, as we get clues in some of the returns, was it a way of getting some payment out of her rather than exempting her altogether? Again, we don't know the answer. But where this happens, it is almost always a widow or a labourer that it occurs for. Of the next 13 entries in the US return, those below the black line on the screen, 4, again around a third, were exempt. One of these stands out because, as with one in the previous assessment, he was a gentleman. Both he and Hayes are low assessments in the return, but both gentlemen are known to have resided in mansion-like houses elsewhere. In both cases, the assessments were for isolated tenanted farms, and that we've already heard about, where he pays for a tenanted farm. Evidently, both tenants were poor because nothing was paid. Occasionally, a gentleman paid a combined assessment for all the houses he owned in a particular parish. So this, I think, must be some sort of agreement with the tenants, whereby the tenant's hearth tax payment is actually built into their rent. I can't see how else it would work. Further down, there is a baronet assessed at only 4 flues, followed by a commoner, known from other sources to be a yeoman, assessed at 11 flues. Without more data, these would be interpreted as entries for 2 separate houses, but in fact we know they were 1. The baronet, Powell, lived 20 miles away at Bourton Montrecy Place in Kent, but owned a number of Sussex manors, including in the neighbouring parish to Ewers, Bodiam, with its ruined castle that he owned, another fortified house and estate in the parish of Iden, and then he had this house in Ewers where he kept rooms, where he could stay when visiting the rest of his Sussex estates. Incidentally, whether it's relevant or not, the house overlooks the ruins of Bodiam Castle, giving a very nice backdrop out of the windows. The rest of Court Lodge, which he had practically rebuilt in the 1650s and is shown here in 1784, was leased out with his domain lands in both Ewers and Bodiam, hence the separate assessment. Powell was a parliamentarian and a gun founder, and surprisingly, he had a royalist friend, the Earl of Thanet, who he saved from utterly ruination during the Commonwealth years. Powell was a colourful and interesting character, but his relevance to us today is because his account books survive. It demonstrates how he was not averse to attempting tax avoidance. In October 1663, Powell paid a bricklayer 7 6d to block up chimneys at the Court Lodge, but he didn't get away with it. Having not got away with it, the following June, he paid the same bricklayer to open them all up again. Later, he records paying Mr. Green, who was the hearth tax collector, for 15 chimneys at the Court Lodge. So by then, he was paying the tax on the entire house for himself. A further complication of the 1662 Sussex returns is that they are not consistent in the way they were compiled. Detailed documentary analysis carried out under the auspices of Christopher Whittick of the East Sussex Record Office over the past 45 years into individual properties in the area on a parish-by-parish basis indicates that some petty customers included all households, regardless of whether or not they were liable for the tax, whilst others excluded all exempt households from lists altogether. Luckily, those which exclude them are recognisable from the lack of 1665 updates with non-payments against them. Based upon present knowledge, it would appear that about 2/3 of the petty constables included all households in their returns. For the remaining third of parishes, it is necessary to augment the numbers in order to gain an estimate of the overall total houses in the parish. This has been achieved by using as a guide data gleaned from the detailed tenement analysis for each parish and from the detailed Compton religious census of Sussex carried out sufficiently close to the main date in 1676. Excluding the Cinque Ports and the inland town of Battle, the returns list 1,885 entries. Allowing for the exempt houses in the parishes for which they're missing increases that number to an estimated, and I repeat, estimated, 2,220. Of this total, 195 or so were in the 6 nucleated village centres. This leaves a total of around 2,025 isolated rural houses, accounting for approximately 2/3 of the total in the area. The remaining third are in the 4 towns, and they have 870 households, or about 28% of the total, and the 6 principal villages, those with more than a dozen houses. And there's 195 entries in there, accounting for only 6%. I said we was a very rural area. Villages are virtually unheard of. The largest of the villages, Robertsbridge with North Bridge Street, had 71 houses. It's worth noting, incidentally, that in some documentary references, the 3 largest of the 6 villages are referred to sometimes as towns. Though I ought to say that one of these, Tysus, the smallest, had only 30 houses in it. We will now turn to the number of flues per house, excluding the 4 towns. Despite the deficiencies highlighted up to this point, the 1662 Hearth Tax return is invaluable as an aid to establishing the approximate distribution of houses of varying size. In very general terms, the more flues a house possessed, the larger and more elaborate it was, 1 flue houses as a class being both the smallest and poorest. Of course, a lot depends upon when the first fireplaces were inserted into individual houses and whether the wealth of its subsequent owners was sufficient to increase the number of heated rooms and chambers in the house. In Sussex, an early insertion often meant building either a 1 or 2 flue chimney backing onto the cross passage, as is the case with the 2 flue axial chimney shown in this particular example. At this time, the high-end room and chamber on the right in the photograph continued to be unheated. But as time passed and a heated sitting parlour became the norm, became the norm in houses of reasonable status, the owners of houses with early chimneys had a choice. In the example shown here, an additional 2 flue chimney was added against the end wall of the high end bay. Ignore the chimney against the far end wall, that is much later, added when the house was divided into cottages. The most common solution, however, was either to replace the 1 or 2 flue axial chimney by a new stack of 3 or 4 flues on the same site, often replacing something of timber with something of brick or stone, or to add fireplaces against the chimney's rear wall, blocking up the cross passage and forming a lobby entry. Both these alternatives involved reversing the uses of the high and low end in order to provide a heated parlour. The house illustrated here is an interesting example of such a conversion. As you can see from this reconstruction, when it was first built, it was a medieval house. And this drawing shows its layout as it was built around 1460. As you can see, it was of textbook tripartite plan with just one bay open to the roof. Into this was added a timber frame chimney and floor in about 1560, retaining a cross passage to the rear of the chimney. In about 1600, the timber chimney was replaced by a brick stack, and in this instance, the brick stack was on a slightly different site, blocking the cross passage and forming a lobby entry. Then, in about 1640, 2 extra fireplaces were added against the chimney's rear wall, and the use of the end rooms reversed. This gave the 4 flues assessed in the hearth tax return for this house. But it must always be remembered there were exceptions to this. A few houses of reasonable status never achieved 3, let alone 4 flues. The house shown here is a case in point. Built on a holding which for the area was large, 160 acres, it was initially a very low house, but of very respectable width. Then, around 1520, either a high-end crosswing was added or the high end was rebuilt as a crosswing. Whichever was the case, that new crosswing incorporated a 1-flue chimney heating a proper sitting parlour. Very quickly after, the main range was rebuilt taller, fully floored, though the floor over the hall was set higher, so the hall was still quite lofty. And the hall was heated by a single flue brick chimney at the low end, backing onto the cross passage. Thus, by now, the house had 2 flues, which, believe it or not, is how it was assessed in the hearth tax returns in 1662. There was, at one time, a detached kitchen, thought to have been out the back. That's normally where they were. That would have been demolished by 1662. So the kitchen we show in this reconstruction at the back of the house is completely conjectural, other than we know it existed. Throughout much of its life, the holding was in owner occupation. But in the 1650s, it went into a period of tenancy, and it was still tenanted in both 1662 and the update to the hearth tax return in 1665. As you can see, despite its 2 flue assessment, it was neither a poor nor a small house. In fact, it had within it a total of 11 rooms and chambers, plus a garderobe serving one of those chambers. Luckily for us, examples like this can be shown to have been uncommon, so the number of hearths can be used to give a general good idea of the distribution of wealth and house sizes in the 1660s. So, what in this respect are the returns of the High Weald able to tell us? This analysis shows a breakdown of how many houses in 1662 had each number of flues. But these figures are difficult to take in at a glance, so let's start by breaking them down in a more simple form. Firstly, before we consider survival, we'll look at what existed in 1662. Over a quarter are assessed at just 1 flue, and only slightly less at 2, which means that taken together, more than half had 2 or fewer fireplaces. Taking the next category up, down on the chart, but up in size, between a quarter and a third were assessed at either 3 or 4 flues, which means 81.5%, well over 3/4 of houses, had 2 or less fireplaces. For comparison, as far as I can tell, the figures for Essex is 87% and for Cambridge 93%. So in this respect, the High Weald seems to be lower than in those two counties. Perhaps, therefore, the number of houses assessed with 5 or 6 flues is higher than in many parts of England, but only 3 in every 100 had 9 or more flues. And this top strata represent what you could call the mansions and great houses of the area. Inevitably, there are marked variations between individual parishes. Using the two adjacent parishes of Northam and Newhurst as a known extreme example, within the exceptionally prosperous parish of Northam, single flue houses accounted for only 14% of the total, whilst in Newhurst, 46% had only one flue. That's more than 3 times the number of poor houses. Northam was so well known for its prosperity that there was a well-known local rhyme, and excuse my accent, "O rare Norgum, thou dost far exceed Beckley, Peasmarsh, Udimore and Breed." Ewhurst is ignored simply because it didn't rhyme, but that was the poorest of the surrounding parishes. As the distribution of surviving medieval, and I repeat medieval houses shown here indicates, the same was as true of Northam for the 14th and 15th centuries as it was for the 17th. The parish served as a particularly successful outpost of the Kentish cloth industry just over the border. To be a gentleman in Northam, you had to be amongst the county elite. When the documentary evidence from 1662 is compared to the physical remains, the results are immediately apparent. The 1662 Hearth Tax return is shown on the left. On the right is the sample of 334 surveyed rural houses which predate 1662 and for which the number of flues can be ascertained. As can be seen, 1 flue houses have survived poorly, whilst houses with 7 or more flues have survived extremely well, with the others falling somewhere between these two extremes. This suggests the lower the assessment, the poorer the occupants, though as already demonstrated, a few good quality houses with early chimneys were never updated. A way of testing how common good-sized rural houses of 1 and 2 flues were is to compare the number of flues in a house with the number of first-floor chambers at the same period. As with flues, the number of chambers in an individual house gives some indication of its size. Statistics for both the number of hearths and chambers can be ascertained for 302 of the sample of surviving rural houses which have been surveyed. 1 flue houses mostly had 2 first-floor chambers, though a reasonable number had 3. 2 flue houses usually had 3 chambers, or, less commonly, 2. 3 flue houses usually had either 3 chambers or, less often, 4. Those with 4 flues were quite evenly divided between having 3 or 4 chambers, whilst those with 5 or 6 flues have a wider spread, but most had 5 chambers. Above that size, the spread becomes much wider, with the number of chambers becoming one number of chambers becoming dominant. Next, we will briefly consider whether particular occupations affected the number of flues per house. Shown here are the number of hearths per occupation in the 26 rural parishes for which occupations are listed. And again, it has to be borne in mind, a few in these returns didn't give an occupation or status group, but it highlights the range of hearths recorded in the houses of each occupational group. The occupations of rank recording the highest average numbers of hearths in their houses are, not surprisingly, the professionals and men of high rank, though the average for these two groups was pulled down by the inclusion of some entries where the owner paid the tax for the occupier, especially those with estates, as discussed earlier. Also in this upper group are innkeepers, victuallers and maltsters, as well as tanners. But of course the innkeepers and victuallers were running pubs of some considerable size, so that more reflects their occupation than their means. The next group down are the Yeoman Farmers. And here again, if you've got several properties and you're paying the hearth tax for them, that pulls down the numbers. Butchers, clothiers are also in this group, though only 3 clothiers are identified by occupation. We know there were more around. And perhaps brickmakers, but only 2 are listed, and carriers, and only 3 of those are listed. So the statistics are very, very thin. Widows are interesting, as they were, as I suppose you'd guess, a very diverse group, ranging from those of low status with very few hearths to some of very high status with multiple hearths. All the other groups have, on average, very few hearths. Husbandmen, which why we're not seeing them being specifically called husbandmen, is mainly because by this date, effectively, the term meant an agricultural labourer or a smallholder, so many would be classed under the labouring group. But also in this group are millers, weavers, those working in the making of clothes and footwear for other people to sell on, the building trades, minor rural craft industries, and, not surprisingly, the labourers. Now, we will briefly turn to the urban centres of the region. As you can see, there were only 6 true urban centres in East Sussex. Yeah, there's only 5 above the main village line, but that'll become obvious in a minute. And none of these urban centres were large in the 1660s. The largest was Hastings, with just over 400 houses. Now it becomes apparent why I was asking how many households in Bristol. I think I've got the total right, but that means the 400 houses in our largest town, Hastings, at this time, was less than a tenth the number of houses in Bristol at the same time. Perhaps if I've got that wrong, somebody can contradict me. Indeed, by then, 1660s, what had easily been the largest town in the region had utterly collapsed to about 30 houses. That's why there's only 5 above the line rather than 6. And despite its retained urban status, was no more than a village. Even by 1565, it had only 109 inhabited houses remaining, almost a tenth of its original number, because it had over 1,000 originally. This is the trouble with ports. They are so dependent upon external factors, of which for the south coast, the most influential was, without doubt, the ever-changing coastline. When Winchelsea collapsed, Rye, further down the same river estuary, has stepped into its shoes and increased in size dramatically, only itself to collapse for the same reason around 1600. As a result, beaching boats on an exposed shore became the only viable option that you had, and so Hastings grew from 280 houses to just over 400 houses in a very short time. That was one of the ports which were beaching their boats on an exposed beach. And the same is true of Brighton, which was a tiny downland village, but by now, the 1660s, it had grown to a reasonable town of 237 houses. And I'm sure, as everyone knows, Brighton has since mushroomed to become a substantial city, but it started off as a small village. But it is Rye, on its tiny island site, with its then 290 surviving houses, we will consider in a bit more detail. What more, if anything, can hearth tax tell us about the town state in the 1660s? At that time, it was divided into 6 wards. Most of the seafarers lived in just 3 of those wards, and not surprisingly, these were the 3 closest to the harbour facilities. In the combined ward of Watchbell and Wish, the number of houses had shrunk over an 85-year period to almost a third of that in 1576. 2/3 of those who remained were seafarers. Badding's ward have fared much better, only losing 14 houses, despite around 3/4 being seafarers. And then we come to Strangate Wall, which is in two parts. One part, see if I can get my cursor, one part here, and this part down on the wharf itself, right on the harbour. Strangate had reduced to between half and 2/3 of its former number, and all the houses on the wharf had been demolished by then. Of the households which remained within the ward, half were seafarers. The number of houses in the 3 landward wards also saw a reduction over the previous 85 years, mostly in Market Ward, where the number halved. This was despite there being few seafarers in these 3 wards. Even so, these were the wealthy wards, being where the professionals, principal traders and main craftsmen tended to live. In addition to the hearth tax returns, there are a number of cesses, that's town taxes. We've got 3 hearth tax returns as well, and also we have a map for 1667, which allows us to gain even more information. What they show us is that houses were still being demolished. In the combined ward of Watchbell and Wish, 6 houses appear to have been demolished in the 1 year between 1662 and 1663. But more importantly, of the survivors, between half and 2/3 were either empty or exempt. 83% either had 1 or 2 flues only. So this was an area of small houses. Badding's ward appears to have lost only 2 houses in the year, but it had a higher percentage of empty and exempt houses. The number with only 1 or 2 flues was similarly slightly higher than in Watchbell and Wish wards. Strangate Ward shows an increase, bucking the trend, of 8 houses in the year, but this seems to have been due to boundary adjustment between it and Langate Ward to the east. In some ways, this area suffered worse than the other 2 wards, in that an even higher percentage, 84%, were either exempt or empty. So that increase is probably to do with the boundary adjustments, and it may have been even worse hit than the other 2, we don't know. Even so, the percentage of 1 and 2 flue houses was very slightly less than for the other 2 wards that we've mentioned. Surprisingly, there was also some decrease during the year within the 3 landward wards, though some of this seems to have been because of the boundary changes that we've already mentioned. The other 13 reduction may be a statistical quirk caused by an error somewhere in our understanding of the documents, or it may have been a genuine reduction. If the latter, it was most likely in Market Ward, where small dwellings above shops are known to have been cleared away during this general period. Whichever the case, not surprisingly, these 3 wards showed the lowest percentage of exempt and empty houses, though the total was still 40%, so it's higher than we see in the rural areas. Likewise, it also had fewer 1 and 2 flue dwellings, but it still accounted to more than half the total. I will leave you with this view of Rye from the south, showing it standing high and dry, stranded in the countryside. Unlike Winchelsea, it was able to survive, albeit in a less prosperous way and at a smaller size. And this was because it was the only trading centre left within the immediate vicinity. And in any case, it did not entirely lose its maritime connections. Small boats could still get up to the town. I suppose it can be argued that this analysis of the hearth tax has brought to light no real surprises. To be honest, it's hard for me to judge because the hearth tax returns have been an integral part of our documentary research over the past 3 to 4 decades, and an integral part of our analysis of the buildings in the area. But even if they haven't raised any surprises, that of course is part of the importance. We need always to test whether what we think we know is correct. Where necessary, we must be sufficiently brave to contradict ourselves and modify our earlier thoughts. That, of course, is the only way knowledge can move on. Thank you very much for listening.